Hello, this is Professor Brown-Cedarberg, and we're going to talk about two methods that you should include in any class that you develop. And those two methods are the toString and the equals methods. Let's first look at the toString method. You notice that it's to, lowercase t, and then an uppercase s on string, and that this method expects no arguments to be passed to it. Now, the toString method is inherited from the class object. And we remember that the class object is the mother of all classes. All classes descend from the class object. It's that first generation. And toString is inherited from the class object through the generations. Now, what the toString method does is it returns back a string of all the values of all the instance variables of the instance that called the method. So it returns back a string that tells us what's stored in all the instance variable spaces of the instance that called the method. Now, we should override the toString method in every class that we develop. And we should do so using this line declaring the method. This method is always public. It always returns back a string, and you'll note that it's non-static. And it's always called toString, lowercase t, uppercase s, and expects no arguments. So it's always public string toString. Now, here's some simple code, a class movie, to demonstrate the toString method. You'll note that this class movie has two instance variables, one of type string called title, one of type int called rating. And we have a default constructor. It's public, named movie, and it puts into the space title the string not yet assigned and rating 0. We then have the method toString. It's always public, it's always non-static, and that makes sense because we want to return back the value stored in the instance variables of the specific instance that called this method. So this method toString is always non-static, and you'll note that it expects no arguments to be passed to it. And what it does is it simply returns back a string. Now, the construction of that string is up to you, but what we typically do is return back the value stored in the instance variable spaces, but give some indication of what it is returning back. So here I've returned back the string title, then concatenated the value stored in title, gone to the next line, printed the string rating, and then concatenated the value stored in the space rating. So we have returned back a string that reads title, the value of the title, rating, and then the value of rating. And this is a typical toString method. Note that it's always public, always non-static, returns back a string, is called toString, and expects no arguments to be passed to it. The second method we're going to look at is the equals method. The equals method, that's a lowercase e and an s at the end, always expects to have something passed into it, an instance of a class. An instance of the class that is of the same class as the instance that called the method. Now this method is also inherited from the class object, and so we'll be overriding it. And what this method does is it compares the values stored in the instance variables of the calling and the past instances of a class. So I compare the values in the instance variables for what called the method and for what was passed to it. And certainly we need to override it in every class. And as we override it, we'll declare it with this line. It's always public. It always returns back a Boolean. It's called equals, and it always expects an argument. And that argument is of the same class as the class that called the method. There's a little leeway in that, and we'll talk more about that in inheritance. All right. Now, here's an example of the method equals. And we'll see again we're using the class movie with the same instance variables, the same constructor method. But here's our method equals. It's always public, returns back a Boolean, named equals, and expects to have passed to it an instance of the class, of the same class that called this method. So here we simply return back a Boolean value. And this Boolean value is generated by comparing the values of the past object to the values of the calling object. And you'll see we do that with this line, this.title.equals, and then in parentheses, movie past.title. So let's look at that. What we're doing is comparing two values, and here's how we get those two values. We know the method equals of the string class will compare that which is passed to it with that which calls it. And we're doing that through equals, and then in those parentheses, moving past dot title. That'll give me the title of the movie that was passed into this method. So that'll give me one string. The method equals will compare it to another string. And the string I'm comparing to that is given to me with this.title. Now, title we know is the name of the instance variable of the class movie that we want to compare something to. Specifically, we want to compare the movie passed, the title of that movie passed to it. But what's this word this? The word this is a substitute for whatever called this method. So whenever you see the word this, substitute for it whatever called this method. So this line, this.title.equals movie pass.title, compares the title of the instance that called this method to the instance that was passed to it. So whenever you see the word this, think of that as whatever called this method. So here we're comparing, using the method equals of the string class, the title of the instance that called this method with the title of the instance that was passed to the method. That's that bit of code. We then, using Boolean logic, compare that to the rating of the instance that called this method and the rating of the instance that was passed to this method. And we do that with this.rating equals moviePass.rating. So here we have, using Boolean logic, the line that first we compare the two titles and we compare the two ratings. And if they're both equal, we return back true. If not, we return back false. That's our equals method. And this is a very typical equals method for a class. So we've looked at two methods. The toString, and we know that the toString returns back a string of all the values of the instance variables of the instance. We know that it is always public, non-static, returns back a string, is called toString, and expects no arguments to be passed to it. We also looked at the method equals. And the method equals compares the values stored in the instance variables, the calling, and the past instances of a class. And it's always declared public, returns back a Boolean, named equals, and expects an argument to pass to it, a value that is an instance of the class that is the same class as the class that called the method. These two methods should always be included in any class that you develop. Thank you very much.